Joe Biden has recently been sort of bigging up this huge infrastructure bill that is going to hopefully pass the US Congress sometime soon. He's been talking about it on Twitter, he's been talking about it on TV and all sorts, and it seems like America is finally going to be getting a big boost, big injection of investment into their infrastructure development and into various different sectors of the economy that's really going to help with growth and living standards improvement. However, it isn't quite all that meets the eye. As is often the case with the US government, things are never just, oh, pretty good. There's always a dark side to it. So the bill is being heralded as this incredible bipartisan achievement because several Republicans are on board with it and a lot of Democrats are on board with it. However, this graphic, which I believe was done by the New York Times, demonstrates very, very effectively and lays out clearly just how reduced and gutted this bill actually is. So on the screen now we have the original proposal, which would have been 2,600 billion, right? So in other words, $2.6 trillion, right? And it included $566 billion in research and development and manufacturing, $387 billion in housing, schools and buildings, $400 billion in home and community-based care, and all kinds of other things like clean energy tax credits, $363 billion, and there was loads of other stuff, roads and bridges, railways, electric vehicles, public transit, and then there's a little thing of $16 billion for cleaning up abandoned wells and mines, right? Now, that seems pretty good, doesn't it? I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there. If you want to, go back and pause and look at the whole thing, go for it, because it is really a remarkable set of investment priorities. However, now let's look at the bipartisan plan. So, in comparison, doesn't look great, does it? Nothing on research and development and manufacturing anymore. Nothing on housing, schools and buildings. Nothing on home and community-based care. Nothing on clean energy tax credits. And an enormous reduction in reconnecting communities and electric vehicles. And reductions in everything else. Except one thing. I don't know if you noticed when we showed up the graph there, we showed the graphic, but there is one thing which has actually been increased in terms of how much money is going to be spent on it in the bipartisan bill in comparison to the original proposed bill, and that is cleaning up abandoned wells and mines and Superfund sites. It's now $21 billion rather than the original 16. So this bipartisan group of Democrats and Republicans, and let's be clear, the kind of Democrats we're talking about are not the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez kind, they're not the Ed Markey kind, hell, they're not even really the Elizabeth Warren kind for the most part. These are total corporatist Democrats, people who are very against Medicare for all, they're against increasing taxes on the ultra-wealthy and super-rich, they're against closing tax loopholes, they're against making Amazon and Google and Facebook and Apple and all those guys pay their fair share. They're against major public housing programs, they're against the Green New Deal, they're against just about every decent proposal there is, and a lot of them are even against the $15 minimum wage, and of course all of the Republicans are against all those things. So the only thing they want to spend more on than was originally proposed is basically cleaning up the mess fossil fuel companies have made. That's the only thing, right? Now, yes, we need to do that, but that bill should be stuck onto those companies. Those companies should have to pay that. And I think you can bet your bottom dollar that will not be the case with this piece of legislation. And also, it really is baffling that they would choose to completely just destroy any of the funding for research and development, manufacturing. I mean, that's just bonkers to me. Electric vehicles, they've massively shrunk that down. They've shrunk everything down, other than that one thing, other than cleaning up the mess made by fossil fuel companies. So let's talk about why that is and why it's a terrible thing. So first off, why on earth would they reduce the package from 2.6 trillion package that includes massive investment in the productive parts of the US economy, in levelling up their infrastructure, which would undoubtedly improve the living standards of the American people and grow the economy? Why have they chosen not to do that? Well, the first and obvious answer that the Republicans and some of those corporate Democrats will say is, well, you know, the deficit or the debt or something. Right? It would cost too much. We can't afford it as a country, because then we'd have to hike taxes and everyone would be poor, and then we'd turn to the Soviet Union, and then Joe Biden would become Stalin, and then we'd all die. Right, so they give this ridiculous. I'm taking the mick, but like, yeah, I'm sure they'll argue that the original proposal was too much spending, and the incredible satirical masterpiece that is the Babylon Bee, of course, did a piece on it. You know, talking about Congress stops with the infrastructure bill to try and figure out which number comes after trillion. The Babylon Bee is just a ridiculous right-wing perversion of satire. But that's what a lot of them say. Now, I'm not sure that's what they think. I don't think it is what they think, because the US they'll happily vote through huge extensions to the military budget. You know, it would be very sensible to actually cut about 200 billion, maybe even 300 billion from the US military budget, and reallocate those resources into other things in the US economy. And of course, as we can see, research and development and manufacturing, $566 billion. So you take 300 billion from the US military budget, you're still going to be getting, you know, a decent amount of that funding. But of course they don't support that. So that's one thing. The main reason, though, is of course that their campaigns and wealthy lifestyles are funded and maintained by corporate donors, particularly people in the fossil fuel industry, but also people in private industries that, if the US started investing more in manufacturing, for example, if the US started doing those things, maybe the industries and the companies that are funding the campaigns and the wealthy lifestyles of these congressional members would be at risk. So they don't want that, so they pour as much money as they possibly can into these politicians. And especially with this whole spending more money only on cleaning up the mess fossil fuel companies have made, of course what happens there is the companies go in, they care nothing at all for the local environment and the local people. They screw things up entirely, make loads of money, but then the company ends up going bankrupt because of mishandling and because they can't continue with that kind of really unsustainable business model. They move on to the next project, take a bunch of money with them, the executives, you know, the CEO and stuff, and then they spend a bit of that money on lobbying Congress and do the same thing over and over again. So Congress just continually gets the taxpayer to pay for cleaning up the fossil fuel companies' mess. So that's the main reason it's happening. But why is it a bad thing, right? Well, first off, that whole thing with the deficit is totally a moot point anyway, because the more you invest in the productive capacity of the economy, that is fixed capital, the more your economy grows. Right? Research and development is incredibly important for improving the living standards of your people, improving your technology, improving every single aspect of the lives of every single person in your country. And then of course manufacturing is essential for growing the economy, providing good jobs to people, getting more money circulating throughout the economy. And all of the other things there are very important as well. So as we've established, this will actually be bad for the living standards of the American people. But not only will it be bad for the living standards of ordinary Americans, it's actually going to weaken America's geopolitical position. This infrastructure bill was a perfect opportunity for America to begin its powerful long-term reassertion of itself on the global stage as a global economic superpower. This was a perfect opportunity to do that. The reason that China has been so successful is because of its ability to be the world's manufacturing hub. It's been the place where the world builds its stuff for a very long time now. Now, one of the reasons for that is incredibly cheap labour, which obviously I would never support the US doing that. But if you invest enough in manufacturing and industry, you can be a serious competitor to China. And because so many Chinese people are being elevated to the middle class now, that whole cheap labour thing isn't going to last forever. Not to mention the fact that automation is taking over far more jobs than are being created, so eventually it's going to be about who spends money and who has the most efficient machines. You don't have to exploit people, right? So the US has this perfect opportunity to become a manufacturing superpower, just as it did after World War II. It has a perfect opportunity to become a global leader in fighting climate change, in green industry, and eventually, if it started to produce a surplus of green energy, and was actually a carbon negative economy, so it was actually absorbing more carbon than it was giving out into the atmosphere, which would be amazing, it could then start selling some of that green energy to other countries, which would again hugely benefit the US. So this is bafflingly stupid on two levels. And it just goes to show how corporate Democrats and every single Republican, they just do not care one jot. They do not care one jot about the US's position on the global stage. They don't actually understand in any considerable way how the US can combat China, because China knows exactly what it's doing, and it's doing it very, very well. China will spend money when it needs to spend money. The US is so dominated by these corporate forces that it just can't seem to do it. It's almost like the Chinese Communist Party is dominant over capital for the most part in its country. And if they step out of line, it deals with them, and it will spend money and invest money when it needs to. The US, on the other hand, seems like the government, the Democratic and Republican parties, are dominated by capital. And that is an incredibly perilous situation for a country to be in. And worst of all is that the American people are going to suffer. Their infrastructure is going to continue to be terrible. Fossil fuel companies are going to continue to get away with murder. And all of the great potential high quality jobs and improvements in living standards Americans were going to get from this investment is now gone. It's gone. And if America has simply abolished the filibuster and implemented electoral reform so that the election maps weren't so rigged, and they had a better election system, they improved their election finance system so there was less influence of big money, that would go a really, really, really long way to being able to pass really good legislation like the original 2.6 trillion proposal. But hey, what do I know? It's a huge shame. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think that this legislation is still a positive step? Or do you think really it's going to be used in the long term to kick the can down the road when it comes to really dealing with climate change and really levelling up America's infrastructure and the quality of jobs and the quality of public services, etc.? What do you think? I'd love to read your comments and your thoughts below. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.